The Picts, one of the most mysterious cultures in history, vanished without a trace. No war, no mass graves, just silence. And in the same northern lands around the same time, a new identity surfaced. Norse settlers, bold and battle-hardened, appearing almost out of nowhere. Historians call it conquest. But what if it wasn't? What if the Viking invasion of Scotland never actually happened? Could the Norse settlers have been the Picts all along? And if so, what was powerful enough to erase that truth? The Painted People and the Sea Kings. Long before the first Norse ship touched the northern coast of Scotland, the land belonged to a different kind of people. Quiet, tribal, and deeply tied to the stone. The Romans called them Picti, the Painted Ones. It's the earliest name we have for them, first recorded around AD 297, and it likely referred to their custom of tattooing or painting their skin. But that label only scratched the surface. The Picts weren't a single tribe or kingdom. They were a loose collection of tribal confederacies, spread across what the Romans called Caledonia, the rugged, forested lands north of Hadrian's Wall. Though they never wrote their own history, they left behind carved stones, over 200 of them, etched with abstract symbols, animals, weapons, and strange geometric shapes. These stones remain some of the most enigmatic relics in British archaeology. No one has fully translated them. No one knows exactly what they were for. But their presence tells us this was a culture deeply concerned with identity, memory, and perhaps even ritual communication. The Picts resisted Roman occupation for centuries. While other British tribes were subdued or Romanized, the Picts held their ground. They were masters of their environment, using dense forests and highland terrain to remain elusive. By the early 7th century, they had evolved into a recognizable kingdom, ruled by high kings and warring with their neighbors, including the Gaels of Dalriada. And then came the Norse. The conventional story begins in 793 AD with the Viking raid on Lindisfarne. From there, Norse activity escalated quickly. They began raiding the coasts of Ireland and Britain, and by the early 800s they were settling in the Northern Isles, Orkney, Shetland, the Hebrides, and even parts of mainland Scotland like Caithness and Sutherland. These settlers spoke Old Norse, worshipped gods like Odin and Thor, and left behind runestones, longhouses, and burial mounds shaped like ships. According to most historians, this was a straightforward process. Norse raiders attacked, conquered, and eventually settled. But here's where things get strange. In the very regions where the Norse appear in the historical record, the Picts disappear, without a trace. There is no record of a great war, no destruction of a capital, no evidence of a cultural collapse. The Pictish kings simply vanish from the chronicles, and in their place, Norse earls and lords begin to appear. How did the Norse take over such vast territory so easily? And why does it feel more like a transition than an invasion? The silence surrounding that shift may be more revealing than anything written down. In those northern lands, it seems one culture didn't replace the other. It became it. Where the Picts fade and the Vikings emerge. By the early 9th century, the Picts were still an established presence, carving massive stones, ruling from hill forts, and honoring a rich oral tradition. But everything shifts after 839 AD. The Pictish kings, led by Uwen or Bride, die in a battle with Norse raiders, and then silence. Their royal lineage ceases. Their symbols vanish. Their language disappears from records. This sudden absence should have sparked upheaval, but instead, the story just goes quiet. And then, in those same northern lands, another name starts showing up: the Norse. More commonly known as the Vikings, these seafaring raiders had been hitting Britain's coasts for decades, but by around 850 AD, they weren't just raiding anymore. They had taken lasting hold of Orkney and Shetland, with Earl Rognvald formally establishing Norse rule. Bishop Rognvald is recorded as the first Earl of Orkney, formalizing Norse authority. Yet there's no dramatic war, no shattered villages, no field of mass graves. Just a calm shift, as though the new order was welcomed or perhaps already in motion. Now here's where it gets weird. At places like Jarlshof and Beersay in Shetland, archaeologists have found something fascinating. Excavations reveal Norse-style longhouses built directly over earlier Pictish foundations, without any evidence of destruction. Everyday objects from those sites, clay pots, combs, metalwork, mix Pictish and Norse design elements, like two cultures folding into each other, not fighting to survive. Even burial practices show a shift rather than a takeover. Pictish mounds give way to Norse chamber graves or ship burials, but some hold grave goods blending Norse swords with Celtic brooches. These aren't signs of conquest. They read more like realignment, familiar people embracing a new identity. And then come the famous Pictish stones. These tall carved slabs, decorated with beasts, crescent shapes, and mysterious symbols, are sometimes recarved with Norse runes, not smashed or thrown away. They were reused. Sometimes Norse runes were carefully carved right over the top, layering new meaning onto the old. The new culture didn't want to erase the past, but to carry it forward. Historians have noticed this too. Alex Wolff, who wrote From Pictland to Alba, says the Pictish identity didn't end because of war. It slowly faded. People married across cultures. Religions blended. Power shifted behind the scenes. And Anna Ritchie, an archaeologist who worked on Pictish sites in the north, called the Northern Isles Digs, points out that new Norse settlements reused Pictish buildings instead of tearing them down. That's not something conquerors usually do. And these discoveries counter the traditional invasion narrative and push us toward a deeper mystery. Why would one identity willingly morph into another so smoothly? Even the Old Norse stories, like the Orkney and Shetland saga, hint at this. The celebrated Orkney and Shetland saga describes men of the land who were already there when Norse leaders arrived, never depicted as enemies, but as locals forging alliances. In one tale, a Norse earl marries a local woman, not a hostage, not a reward for victory, just a strategic alliance. No conquest story there. When you put it all together, the vanishing Picts, the quiet rise of the Norse, the mixed artifacts, the shared graves, the sagas, the DNA, it all points in the same direction. This wasn't an invasion. It was a transition, a rebranding maybe. But the real evidence lies not in battles or borders, but in their bodies, their bones, and the marks they wore. Proof that these weren't strangers at all. Unveiling the hidden connections. There's a strange thing that happens when you look too closely at where one culture ends and another begins. The lines blur. Instead of one replacing the other, the story seems to be one of quiet transformation. The Picts, in both legend and historical record, were described as people marked by tattoos or painted symbols. Picti, after all, means painted ones in Latin. While the exact details are debated, many historians believe their bodies were marked with symbols using natural dyes like woad, especially during rituals or battle. The art carved into their symbol stones, spirals, zeed rods, beast forms, may have mirrored the designs worn on skin. These markings weren't just for show. They were likely spiritual or social identifiers passed down across generations. Centuries later, when Norse settlers arrived, we see a surprising continuity. Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan wrote that the Rus, Norsemen in Eastern Europe, were tattooed from the neck to the toes, using designs made from plant-based ink. While this wasn't directly observed in Scotland, it suggests a cultural openness to body marking within Norse society. Combined with references in Old Norse sagas to magical rune carving on skin and ritual painting during ceremonies, it becomes clear that the Vikings may have continued, or even adopted, the same tradition the Picts once practiced. Beyond tattoos, the way these cultures lived reveals even more parallels. The Picts established tight-knit, kin-based communities spread across the Highlands, islands, and coastal areas. They built hilltop fortresses like Burghead and Craig Fadrig that served as trade hubs, centers of leadership, and places for ceremonial rites. Archaeological finds show a society that was well organized, with intricate jewelry, imported goods, and fine metalwork. all clear signs of a thriving, interconnected culture. When the Norse arrived in Orkney, Shetland, and beyond, they didn't simply replace the Pictish way of life. Instead, their way of life mirrored many of the practices already in place. Excavations at places like Jarlshof reveal longhouses built over earlier Pictish structures, not in conquest, but as a continuation. Farming remained at the heart of daily life. Norse tools found alongside Pictish-era pottery show clear stylistic overlap, suggesting a blending of artistic traditions rather than a break from them. The materials used by the Norse in their daily lives weren't entirely new. They were reimagined versions of what the Picts had known, modified by their own touch, but rooted in the same practices. Religious and symbolic elements also overlap. The Pictish Zeed rod, a mysterious motif crossing a crescent or double disc, resembles Norse bind runes, where multiple runes were combined for magical or sacred power. Raven iconography appears in both traditions, tied to war, fate, and spiritual vision. Both cultures honored ancestors through stone markers, standing stones, burial mounds, and ceremonial alignments tied to the sky. And both had spiritual classes, druids among the Picts, Godi among the Norse, who held social and ritual authority without leaving behind written records. Even the evolution of language in northern Scotland also tells the story of gradual blending. Many of the place names in Orkney and Shetland, like Thurso, Stennis, and Unst, show a mix of Norse and older pre-Norse elements. This points to a slow, layered development of language. There wasn't a sudden language shift or replacement. Rather, Old Norse terms were gradually incorporated into the Celtic language spoken by the Picts, creating a hybrid that mirrored the cultural fusion taking place on the ground. And then comes the genetics. A 2023 study by the University of Cambridge found that skeletons in Viking-age Norse burials across Orkney had strong genetic continuity with earlier Pictish remains. These weren't foreign colonists replacing a native population. They were descendants of the same people, redefined under new symbols and leadership. Cultural adoption, not population replacement, was the real shift. When we put all the evidence together, it's clear that the story isn't one of violent conquest, but of cultural blending. The Picts didn't disappear, nor were the Norse complete outsiders. Instead, these two cultures shared land, symbols, practices, and stories that shaped the region for centuries. The Norse identity in Scotland may have emerged from the land itself, a transformation, not an invasion. But what if the Picts didn't disappear by force, but chose to transform themselves into something new, a final spiritual rite? The final rite of the Picts: transformation, not extinction. As we examine the gradual blending of the Picts and the Norse, it becomes clear that the transition wasn't just a matter of cultural fusion, it was a deliberate transformation. The Picts didn't simply fade away. They chose a new path, one that would allow them to preserve their traditions under a different banner. The question isn't how the Picts were replaced by the Norse, but why they might have chosen to become the Norse in the first place. By the time the Norse arrived in Scotland, the Picts had already been shaped by centuries of ritual and spiritual beliefs that bound them to the land. Their kingship passed through the mother's line, a matrilineal system rooted in sacred tradition. This kind of leadership often culminated in sacrifice, a powerful ritual that could explain the disappearance of the Pictish elite. Rather than being wiped out, it's possible they chose to transition, a spiritual passing of the torch that mirrored the deep rituals that had guided them for centuries. As Christianity spread throughout the region by 800 AD, the Picts found themselves in a spiritual crisis. With their animistic and druidic beliefs being replaced by Christianity, they faced the potential extinction of their culture. At this moment, they may have chosen to erase their old identity voluntarily, rather than have it overwritten by an external force. The idea of transforming into Norse warriors could have been a spiritual strategy, a way of rebirthing their society while maintaining their core beliefs, but under the guise of the Norse pantheon and warrior ideals. The Norse gods themselves were not so foreign to the Pictish worldview. Thor, for instance, closely resembled the Celtic god Tyrannus, and Odin shared traits with Isis or Lugus. The warrior kings, revered for their freedom and mythic power, may have offered an idealized future that resonated deeply with the Pictish warrior elite. They could have seen in the Norse gods a continuation of their own spiritual narrative, a more powerful and acceptable version of the deities they had once worshipped. In the material record, we see signs of this transition: hybrid stones in Orkney and Caithness with runes and Pictish symbols together, and references to the painted men in Norse sagas. This wasn't a cultural annihilation, but a merging, as the Picts chose to adopt the Norse identity, perhaps as a way to preserve what they had, while embracing the future. This wasn't the end of the Picts. It was the final rite, the transformation that ensured their legacy lived on. So, what do you think about this theory? Could the Norse identity have been a rebirth, not a conquest? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing stories. Thanks for watching.